gospel we preach must apply to every area of life that has been fouled by sin and its effects. The church and individual Christian evangelists must preach the biblical gospel of comprehensive redemption, not just personal soul winning. Wherever sin reigns, there the gospel must be at work, transforming and restoring.
Hi, and welcome to the Devoted Word. I'm Joel McDermott, your host, and we are brought to you by The American Vision. Please check us out at americanvision.org. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and also consider becoming a monthly supporter of this ministry. Follow the links at the bottom or at the end of this video to find out how to do that, or visit americanvision.org. Thank you for joining us today. Once again, we're going to study the last verse in the first chapter of Genesis. Finally. Now, you may have thought we got through the image of God in man in verses 26, 27. We got through the dominion mandate, which is a big topic, a lot to share there, in verses 26 and 28. And it almost seems a bit anticlimactic to kind of finish out that chapter. It kind of reads almost as if this is kind of repetitive, or it's just kind of filler. The climax is over with, everything else is smooth sailing. But there's a very important concept in verse 31 that we need to look at, and in fact we've already kind of touched on it because it shows up in previous verses. But let's read verse 31 quickly and go from there. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening and the morning were the sixth day. Now, chapter 2 starts out talking about the seventh day and God's Sabbath rest. And that kind of ties into this topic as well, because the Sabbath day, or I should say the day of God's rest, is also the day of God's judgment, because he looks back over the whole and judges it. But he also does that here on verse 6 on the sixth day. On verse 31 on the sixth day. 5 times, actually, previous to this, in the first chapter of Genesis, God has stopped to review all that he has created up to that point. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. I've done articles on this on the website on Genesis 1 on the issue of assessment, self-assessment, and judgment along in terms of progress. Now, this is absolutely an important concept in terms of progress when we look at work done in history, so that God's work becomes reflective of our work. And we'll come back and look at that kind of in the larger picture later as well. But just to mention it here, that it is an aspect. If you are working toward a creation, if you will, a large project that is taken care of in steps along the way, it is almost necessary to stop and review what you've done and to pass judgment upon it, to assess it, to see if it goes along with the plan, right? So that you know you're on track going forward. But here we get to the last of these, and God looks over what is the finished creation, and on the end of that sixth day looks over all of his works, and it says he looked on all that he did, and it was not just good, it was very good. It was greatly good. You might say in the Hebrew it was, to quote a neologism we've heard recently, bigly good. Don't want to make too much of that, but it is there. It's in the Hebrew. God saw that it was very good. Now, what is this? God is stopping to look back over what he has done. Now, of course, what he has done is going to be good because it's God doing it. You know, there's not going to be any oops in that equation anywhere. God's not going to look back and say, wait a minute, I did that wrong, or I did this wrong. No, it was God's plan, God's execution. It was perfect, and so of course it was going to be good. But the act of still assessing it is not redundant. It is part of God's nature to judge. He is a righteous judge, so it is his nature to assess and to impute value through his judgment. And that's important not only as the objective reality that it is, as the piece of theology proper that it is, but also as an example for us who are his image. And that is what it's taken me all this time to get to. The main point of this verse and the main lesson for today is that of the imputation of value. And this has two parts to it. Actually, more than two parts, but we'll look at it in two main parts. That is, first of all, God's imputation of value to the creation, and second of all, man's imaging of that imputation in creation. And when I say imputation now, this is important because if you're a theology student, you have historically understood the word imputation in the narrow sense of salvation and justification. And we speak of that in theology, or in the doctrine of salvation, soteriology, that Adam's sin was imputed to Christ, and Christ's righteousness was imputed to us, and that Christ's active obedience and his righteousness in that regard is imputed to us as we speak, so that even our actions now as Christians are not pure and perfect in God's sight, and we need his righteousness. And so the doctrine of imputation has historically addressed that aspect of theology. But the word imputation has much greater, broader application, and that's how it's being used here. And that is the imputation of value. When we say imputation in this theater, we're talking about God's imputation of value to creation in general. And by the way, the word imputation simply means reckoning or taking account of. God reckons our sin to Christ, and he suffered on the cross for us. As a result of that, God reckons Christ's righteousness to us. When he looks at the account books, is Joel McDermott righteous? Check mark, yes, he is. Not because of my own righteousness, but because of Christ, which was put on the ledger under my name. Yes, he is righteous. We can check this off. So the same is true in God's creation. God creates the world, and he creates it perfectly because he's God, and what God creates is perfect. Perfect according to his will and his character and his standards. It is objective. When he is done creating, he looks back over it, and it is perfect. It is good. And he can say that intrinsically of the thing itself because he created it that way. Yet at the same time, it has subjective value because God is the one declaring it that way. And obviously there's a larger discussion that could be had there that is pertaining to what ifs, but we won't go there for today. The creation was good because it was the product of God's sovereign plan. And yet the doctrine was good because he declared it to be good, and therefore it as a subject conforms to his word. And both of those aspects are important in and of themselves, but also for the doctrine of imputation as it relates to us imaging God. We'll get to that in just a minute. It is important here to see that God is the imputer of value. Now, why would we go on about this and make a big deal about it? Well, it's biblical truth to begin with, so let's just get that out of the way. But second of all, this shows up in every area of life, in every academic discipline, in every branch of theology, especially when you apply theology to every area of life. How is this the case? Well, if you read Gary North's commentary on economics, on this passage in Genesis, he lays out a long case in the area of economics. He shows how, historically in economics, there has been a dispute over how are things considered valuable by men, by people in history, not just men, but women as well, and children. Why do some things have value? And there are competing schools of thought. Now, if you've studied your Van Til, if you go back and listen to our discussions on the one and the many, and how that implies either if you fall to the one side of or the other in philosophical thought in a humanistic system, you will end up with some form of a tyranny or some form of chaos. Those are the two ends of that spectrum. And you will, without a Trinitarian view of the world and a biblical worldview, you will fall on one of those two spectrums in every area of life. absolutely true here when it comes to the imputation of value in creation. What happens if someone looks at this and some human being says the standard of what is valuable, or the standard by which we make ethical judgments in history, is, say, John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, the classic statement, says that what is good is that which benefits the most of the people the most of the time, that which brings the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. Now, how does that work out? Well, one of those applications in economics has been traditionally welfare economics. They talk about, there's an economic law of the law of diminishing returns, and this is a true thing. If I only have $10 to my name, and this Bible costs $10, or some other book costs $10, and I need one of them for salvation, obviously there's going to be a choice made. I'm going to value this over that one. However, if I only have $10 to my name, and there's a Bible here for sale for $10, or there's a meal to eat for a portion of that money, and I'm starving to death, where's the money going to go? Obviously, I'm going to put my value here. Okay, but now if I have $100, obviously those choices are much easier to make, because the more of those dollars that I have, the less valuable each one becomes. So what if I make $100 an hour? I might have a whole shelf of Bibles and a whole refrigerator and freezers full of food, and like to go out and eat and party all the time. And the more money I compile, the theory says, the less each one of the next dollars that comes in is of marginal value to me. So that the law is the law of diminishing returns. Each dollar that comes in is worth less to me because I am a wealthy man in that scenario. I'm not really a wealthy man, but in that scenario I am. So the welfare economists look at this and say, look, at some point the rich, his money doesn't mean as much to him. It's not as valuable to him as it is to the poor man who's begging for a piece of bread. So it is right, we can bring a greater amount of happiness to a greater number of people if we take some of that marginal return that he gets and redistribute it to the poor. This is a utilitarian application to economics and the wealth, the government redistribution of wealth, so that welfare economics flows out of that. But what's going on here is that a collective definition is being used to destroy individualistic valuations in society. Now, granted, there's a real problem with the poor man, and we do need to address that some way, and so that is an issue. But when we're talking about political science and creating laws attached to economic principles, we see the dangers of that system, such that on a spectrum, this goes from simple applications of them in a very simple welfare state, and perhaps in a very few limited scenarios, to a more consistent application of those things in a socialist democracy, democratic socialism, or in something like the Soviet Socialist Republics or Communist China or something on the spectrum. And so you're using a collective, the one, to overrule the valuations of the many. And is that fair or not? I would say it's against the Bible. Nevertheless, if we don't have those valuations, you end up, North demonstrates this quite well, with the problems inherent in the radical individualists. And when we're speaking logically, it may seem like academic hair splitting, but you run into logical scenarios where not only can one man not even do business with another man because their valuations are different, but each individual person himself's valuations change with each moment of time, so that you run into what is what's called a collidic scenario, such that there is no way really to have any meaningful standard of value socially, even for the individual with himself. So these are all logical problems that occur. And so what happens? You need to have something that harmonizes these interests. And it's only capable of happening in a situation in which there is a higher law, a higher valuation, which overrules both the one, the tyranny, and the tyranny of chaos, which is the radical individualism, to which both of those systems have to look up and to harmonize to. And that's what you get in the biblical model. You have God, who is a Trinitarian God, by the way, in whom the one and the many are fully harmonized. But you have this God creating a created order and decreeing it good, that it has intrinsic value in and of itself, but also providing the higher law by which things are to be valued, and therefore setting general priorities for us and things of that nature. And all of this comes together. North does a superb job of laying this out in detail in his commentary, which we will eventually link to in this series. The problem is, ultimately, in any humanistic system, it is impossible to measure the subjective value between two people. One guy values something one way, another values it a different way. How do we harmonize this? It is easiest simply either to decree that there's a just price for everybody, which is what has been done in the past. The church tried to do that in the past. In the medieval era, governments try to do that today. And I'm saying that's easy. It's not right, but it's easy. And it also causes problems. It's also easy simply to say, let the market decide. But a market without morality is a market in which perhaps the poor not only don't get taken care of, but the Word of God doesn't get taught, that there is no general morality even. There's no higher law. There's no regard for higher law. And so you may have a proliferation of pornography or other issues like that cause degeneration socially over time. So how do we take care of this? Oh, and by the way, abortion, which flows out of that. So in which case we, under the guise of protecting property and valuing private property and the rights of privacy and all of that, go to the extreme of allowing the murder of unborn human beings. So are we to allow that type of subjective utility to reign as well? Obviously we should not. But that's a huge debate in our society today, and it is a debate in our society today because we have gotten away from the single higher law. Now, a lot of this sounds like philosophical speculation, philosophical talk, and it is. But the reason we have all of that philosophical speculation and philosophical talk is because men depart from the narrow path of God's Word. And when we get away from the example God has set for us, and that is judging things in society by His Word, and then performing our personal valuations in society accordingly, with reference to His Word, when we get away from that, we run into all manner of evil. When we run away from the simple fact that God exists and imputes value to His creation, we start trying to do all of that ourselves, and we run into all kinds of problems. And the people who want liberty, whether they be libertarian or anarchist or whatever, nevertheless end up doing so on their own terms. And the people who go to the collective side of things generally tend to win in society for various reasons. And we have a complaint against them. But if you're complaining against them in terms of wanting to set liberty by your own standards, or even just have a constitutional framework in which you can do that freely, but without reference to God, okay, all you're going to do is justify the fears of the people who run back to the collective, whether it's for welfare, protecting their children, educating their children, having food stamps and food to eat or whatever that may be, they're going to find their safety in numbers and in a collective system rather than liberty. Even though we may give lip service to something like Thomas Jefferson's ethic, I would rather have the troubles attending too much liberty than those that attend too little of it. We may all give lip service to that, but we will run inevitably to statist solutions because of the fears that come along with too much liberty. And the truth is that both of those systems are wrong if God's law is not in the center of what we're doing. We can yelp about liberty all day long, but it won't matter as long as we are not making our valuations according to His Word. A lot to be said there, agreed. I just wanted to get this general point here that is so well put by Dr. North in his commentary on this verse. He ends it up by saying this, and I'll quote, "This leads to a uniquely biblical principle of economic science. The image of God in men is the metaphysical foundation of economic thought and action. Without this basis for our knowledge and valuation, there could be no consistent, rational science of economics. The heart of man's problem is not metaphysics, meaning the reality of man's being and the underlying foundation of existence. Man's problem is ethics. It is obedience to God. The closer that men come to obeying the terms of God's covenant, the closer their judgments will conform to the God-created reality." In other words, I'll put it this way, the closer we will come to valuing God's creation objectively and valuing God's creation subjectively. In other words, our own perception of what is right and good in society will conform to God's objectively, and it will also do so subjectively because our words will line up with His Word. And when those things harmonize, then you have the maximized liberty for society. And it is our job as God's image in society, His image in creation, to recognize that and to obey it. And like I said, this is true in economics, it's true in the marketplace, it is true in political science, it's true in law and legislation. What is legislation but the speaking of a particular ethical value into society and the forcing of everybody to conform to it? Well, now think about that. If we are continually writing laws, some of which are in addition to God's simple outline of laws for us, and some of which are in direct defiance of that law, but even if we just stick to the ones that are in addition to it, what are we doing? We're saying, well, God's law didn't go far enough. We have to write another law that says, in order to remain safe in society, you can't drive over 65 miles an hour in this spot or 35 here or whatever. We got to have traffic laws. Or we got to have this law or that law. Or we got to have a law that says you can't drive a car unless you have insurance for it. We can't find a better way to solve this in a free society. We have to write laws to force these things to happen. Socialism in general is the same way. All wealth redistribution is the same way. Public school system is the same way. Every law we write is the same way. And again, this is just including the ones that are expanding on God's principles, not necessarily the ones that defy it, which I would think public school does. But anyway, open defiance of God's law is a whole different thing. What are we doing in that case? We are saying God's valuations of things don't go far enough. We have to add additional man-imputed values in society, and then we force everybody to conform to that. What is that? It's a form of collectivism. What happens when we refuse to apply God's laws in areas in which men are defying them? Whether it be in the marketplace, or take the history of slavery, for example, or various other things in which atrocities are committed and we don't do anything about it. What are we doing? We're letting chaos and radical individualism, or some form of individualism, have sway in that regard. So that these principles are just as true in the area of law and legislation and government as they are in economics, as Dr. North lays out. It's true also in historiography, how we write and view history. It's true in sociology. It's true in every academic discipline. And so we need to take this absolutely seriously. The doctrine of God looking back on his creation and judging it is important for us in how we view creation. It's important for us as God's image in how we understand and act in creation. Because as God imputed value to the creation, so do we. That's what the marketplace is. It is the sum total of human valuations competing with each other in a grand auction, if you will, of all the goods and services that are available to us. The same is true in the marketplace of ideas. The same is true in the marketplace of the law and all these attendant areas. And so our valuations are supposed to mimic that which we image, and yet often, most of the time, we don't. So this doctrine of imputation is absolutely crucial for how we behave as God's people in society. And it really, truly ought to ring from the pulpits. There ought to be sermons and Bible studies on the doctrine of God's imputation of value to the creation and what that means for God's image in society. And it may not happen because simply people don't think about this and people don't study it this way, but it may also be uncomfortable to people to say, wait a minute, this means that I have a God-given duty to look at economics in a particular way, to look at money in a particular way, to look at the abuse of women in a particular way, to look at abuse in general in a particular way, to look at law in a particular way, to look at government in a particular way, to look at American history in a particular way, to look at world history in a particular way. And even, you might say, to look at the uses to which we put engineering and architecture and chemistry, physics, and aerospace engineering, all the uses to which we put those things in a particular way. So that, as I wrote one time, that there is actually a biblical way to fly an airplane. Absolutely there is, because the ethics behind it, if nothing else, the ethics behind which we do it, have to be imputed according to God's standard, not our own. So that in the end, our problems are ethical as primarily before they are metaphysical. It's not our job to go learn the metaphysics of everything. It is our job to obey God within the realm in which that metaphysics upholds everything. So that's the lesson for today. Don't think that once you've got to the image of God and man and the dominion mandate that suddenly the climax of the chapter is over with. No, there is a very important principle that's been at work all through the first chapter of Genesis and which rounds out the end of the first chapter of Genesis, and that is God's imputation of value in creation. And guess what? You have to do it too. I hope that you would start with valuing this podcast and consider becoming a monthly supporter. So that's it for today on the Devoted Word. Check us out. Like I said, like and subscribe. Check us out at AmericanVision.org. And like I said, consider becoming a monthly supporter and help us with this ministry. We need you, and we certainly appreciate you. As always, I always say it, we appreciate your time and your support.